Hi, my name is Dr Danielle Leighton, and I'm a clinical lecturer in neurology at the Institute of Neurological Sciences in Glasgow. And I'm going to be talking about the genetic landscape of motor neuron disease in Scotland. Now, I'm predominantly a clinical clinician, but 20% of my time is spent doing research. And I did a research fellowship, a PhD, supported by MND Scotland. And my research now is really focused on the clinical translation of lab-based research and other research that I've been doing to try and see if we can modify clinical practice and improve things for people living with motor neuron disease. So what I'm going to talk about is a summary of my research that I've done in the genetics of MND in Scotland. And I'll talk as I go along about how this translates into day-to-day clinical practice. And then talk a wee bit more about future research and considerations regarding MND genetics, the future of MND genetics. And then at the very end, I'll provide some resources for people who are particularly interested, who want to find out more. So just a little summary about the genetics of motor neuron disease. We don't really know what causes motor neuron disease. There's obviously a lot of laboratory research and a lot of clinical research. It's thought to be caused by a mixture of the environment, things that act from outside, time, as in aging, and genes. So genes that you're born with and make up your genetic makeup. But for the majority of people, the exact cause is never known. In a proportion of people, MND is genetic, and we can identify a gene in a blood test. And this gene change can be inherited or passed down in families. And as we learn more about the genetics of motor neuron disease, people with MND are, of course, becoming increasingly interested in pursuing genetic testing and finding out how they can access that and how that might impact them and their families. So I've got this graph on the screen, which is actually made by one of our colleagues who's presented on another of these MND LEARN educational talks. And this really just summarizes the number of genes that have been discovered associated with MND over the years. So each dot represents a different gene, a different part of DNA where there's an abnormality that might cause MND. And as you can see, over the past 30 years or so, there's been many genes that have been discovered, and that's continuing to increase. So this is an evolving field, and doctors like myself need to be able to react to this and guide people through this information. So what my research was during my PhD was to look at something called the genetic epidemiology of Scotland, of MND in Scotland. And genetic epidemiology just means the frequency of gene abnormalities affecting people living with MND in Scotland. So what I did was I selected lots of different genes to study, and they're shown in this table here. They've all got lots of different acronyms, different ways of labeling these gene names. And this was using information developed by colleagues in London, colleagues in Sheffield, and also I worked closely with Columbia University in New York, and selected these 48 genes to study, as well as the C9orf72 expansion, which is the most common gene associated with motor neuron disease, but we need to test for it in a slightly different way. And this is a bit technical, but it's just to say that the way that we studied this was using a classification system which has been developed in America and the UK, as a genetics classification system, which is quite a strict system to work out which genes are relevant and which genes are not, to give us a really realistic representation of the genes that are affecting our people living with MND in Scotland. So this is the results of the genetic epidemiology study, and this was published in 2024. And there were 339 people over a 3-year period who kindly donated a DNA sample, a blood sample, to contribute to the study. And what we found was that this part of the pie chart in dark blue represents 13% of people who had what we call a potentially pathogenic or potentially disease-causing gene. And the grey area in the pie chart represents people who had gene changes which are probably not related to their disease. And the lighter blue represents gene changes that we don't quite know the significance of. And this is a challenge and something that we are need to keep working on to try and figure out the significance of these. But we'll focus on the ones in the dark blue slice of the pie chart. So what we found was that C9orf72, which is the commonest genetic cause of motor neuron disease, was found in 30 individuals in Scotland. So that represents about 9%. The SOD1 gene, which people may have heard about recently as it's been in the news quite a lot, and I'll come back to that, was found in 12 people. So that represents about 3.5% of the Scottish population. This is actually found in about 2% of other populations, so it's slightly higher frequency in Scotland. And that is probably due to this particular genetic change, which is it's classified using these letters and numbers, but essentially this is a genetic change that seems to have originated in Scotland and seems to be relatively common in Scotland. It is present in other parts of the world, but particularly common in Scotland. So we call it a genetic founder mutation in Scotland. We also identified genetic changes in these more rare genes, NEC1 and FUS. And just to kind of break this down a little bit, so we looked at people who had a family history of MND, whose MND was thought to be inherited through different family members, and those who didn't have a family history of MND. And we found that 32% of people with a family history had C9orf72 and 21% had the SOD1 mutation. So we could explain 54% of people who had a family history through these genetic tests. But even in those people who didn't have a family history of motor neuron disease, so no one else in the family is thought to have had motor neuron disease, even in those people, 9% had a genetic cause. And again, it was mainly these two most common genes, C9orf72 and SOD1. We had a quick look to see if there was any link between the clinical characteristics, the features of those individuals who had the genes. And we found that in both people with C9orf72 and SOD1 gene changes, it was associated with a family history, which we would expect. So more people were likely to have a family history of MND. But we also found that people with the C9orf72 mutation are more likely to have a poorer cognitive score on ECAS screening. And that's the cognitive screening test that we do for all people with motor neuron disease. So more likely to have problems with memory and behaviour. These other findings didn't quite meet statistical significance on testing, but we did find that overall people with C9orf72 mutations were less likely to be initiated on NIV, which is non-invasive ventilation, and overall had poorer survival. So it may predict poorer survival. And those with SOD1 mutations, they all seem to have limb onset disease predominantly and not require feeding tubes, suggesting that there was less problems with speech and swallowing. So just to summarise this, and the kind of main take homes from this is that when we do this very structured assessment of the genetics of people in the Scottish population, we find that overall 13% of people have a potentially pathogenic mutation, so a genetic cause of their motor neuron disease. And this comprises just over half of those with a family history, But even in those who don't have any obvious family history of motor neuron disease, almost 10%, so 9% of those have a gene abnormality. We found that C9orf72 mutation correlates with the abnormal memory and behaviour score, and we found that Scotland is what we call enriched, so there's more of this particular Scottish SOD1 gene. So essentially, the take home from this is that in view of these findings, in view of the fact that we're seeing people with quite a few people with genetic MND in Scotland, we have recommended testing as part of the diagnostic workup for motor neuron disease, particularly in those with a relevant family history and those with memory, cognitive or behavioural change. So how does this translate to clinical practice? How does this translate to what happens in the clinic when someone with MND comes to clinic? So we now have this gene panel, which anyone in Scotland can be offered for genetic testing. And we've amended this to include all the genes that we think are relevant to the Scottish population. And this is what we find really is that the questions are, who should we discuss genetics with? And we think we should discuss genetics with everyone with motor neuron disease, to give everyone the opportunity to take this information in and decide if they want to think about genetic testing themselves. And who should have genetic testing? So anyone can have genetic testing with the appropriate information, so they kind of know what their what the implications of that would be. So what services do we have for people with motor neuron disease in Scotland? So we offer everyone DNA storage or DNA banking. So anyone that comes to clinic can store a DNA sample in the NHS laboratories, and this could be tested at a future date. So it means that you don't have to decide exactly the route you're going down with regards to genetics. In the first instance, you can store a sample and then you can decide later. Or that sample might be relevant to family members in the future. If someone else were to develop motor neuron disease in the family, then they would be able to access that. We offer DNA diagnostic testing and genetic counselling. So we offer testing in the clinic, and we can feedback those results, and we can also offer genetic counselling to individuals and their families. In addition to this, we can also talk about people who have a family history of a gene but don't have MND, and talk about the possibility of doing what we call predictive testing, where we would test that individual to try and work out if they might develop MND in the future. Though there are some uncertainties associated with that, because even if you have a gene, then you might not develop motor neuron disease. It's not certain that you will develop it. And finally, we also can offer pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for those families that have a gene in the family. We can offer an IVF process to try to prevent a gene being inherited in offspring. So the key points regarding this, just sort of take some take-home messages, and this has been passed on by one of the genetic counsellors I work with, is that genetic testing for people with motor neuron disease is optional. The results may have implications for relatives, so all related individuals, children, siblings, nieces and nephews, etc. Support is available throughout the process, through the genetic counselling process, and stored samples can be tested in the future if you are not quite sure what you want to do, but you change your mind later. So what's the future of MND genetics in Scotland? So by doing this research, one of the aims was to get a clear impression of how genetics affects people with MND in Scotland, so that we know who might be suitable for genetic drug trials in the future. So for example, we can say we have this percentage of people with this gene in Scotland. So if a drug trial was to come along, we would be able to offer a proportion of patients who might be suitable for that. It allows us to work out what to do if there were to be genetically targeted drugs approved in the future regarding genetic testing. So it allows us to think about maybe testing more people to see who's eligible for future drugs. The cons are that we're obviously very early on in drug treatments for motor neuron disease. There's still not much available yet. And drugs that come through in drug trials now and in the future might not benefit patients in their lifetime. And also, this is a relatively new area, trying to get genetic treatments into NHS clinical practice. And there's barriers to that because it's not been done before. And obviously that's just something that as clinicians and scientists, we just need to work through with NHS managers. So just a little bit more information about the kind of resources that we have available for research and how to sort of access research and how to access information about genetics in the future. So we recruited patients for this particular study through CARE MND, which stands for Clinical Audit Research and Evaluation for Motor Neuron Disease. And this is a platform where individuals can register interest in research and find out what research is available to them. And on this platform, we also did a study looking to see how useful this platform is, and we record about 99% of people living with MND in Scotland using this platform. So it's a really helpful resource for clinicians, for scientists, for researchers, and for people who are with MND who are interested in research to access information. The current clinical trials and drug therapies that we have on offer are MND Smart, which is the biggest drug trial in the UK for motor neuron disease, which is centred in Edinburgh but is available across the UK. And it's a platform trial looking at various different drugs. And it's not genetically stratified, so it's not specific for genetic types of motor neuron disease, but there will be genetic studies that come out of that. There's also another drug trial called Experts, which is centred down in England, but was becoming more available in Scotland. Again, it's not looking at specific genetic subtypes, but that may be something that emerges later. And there are genetic studies looking at particular genetic subtypes of motor neuron disease, including the ACORN study, we're looking at C9orf72, and the MAGNET study looking at another small mutation, UNC13A. And these are not currently available in Scotland, but may come to Scotland. And so what drug therapies are there? So you may have heard of something called Trafersin, which is an emerging drug treatment for a genetic type of motor neuron disease. So I'm just going to talk about that a little more. So essentially, this is the outcome of a lot of this genetic research. This is why we do this genetic research, is to try and see if we can develop drugs that would target these particular genetic abnormalities associated with motor neuron disease. And there is a drug that has been through clinical trials that is shown to have some benefit for people with SOD1 type of motor neuron disease. And this drug has been approved by the regulatory bodies in the licensing bodies in the UK, sorry, but it's not been approved by the regulatory bodies for clinical use in Scotland or in England yet. But that those application processes are in progress. So it's not a drug that we can currently use in clinical practice, but as you can see from this campaign banner, which was from the MND Association, and there's also been lots of information from MND Scotland, there is a drive to try and get this approved for people with SOD1 type of motor neuron disease. And this drug has been shown to have benefit in terms of muscle function, in terms of quality of life, and in reducing the abnormal protein that seems to be driving the type of motor neuron disease. So it's not a cure, but it is something that seems to help. And hopefully this will pave the way for many other drugs in the future that are targeting genetic types of motor neuron disease. And just a reminder that we have a relatively high proportion of people with this SOD1 mutation in Scotland, 3.5%. It's still very small, very small proportion of the MND population in Scotland, but still extremely important that we if this drug is approved, then we should hopefully be able to access this in the future. So just a little bit of information about where you can get some resources of where you can get information about genetics of motor neuron disease and also research studies. So first of all, obviously, it's a good place to start is the MND Scotland website. It takes you through all the basics of what is motor neuron disease, what is inherited motor neuron disease, and just to get a really good broad overview. The CARE MND website that I'd talked about as well, where all our Scottish research is sort of housed as a hub for that, is an excellent resource. And then there's some UK resources which I would also direct you to. So there's the UK MND Clinical Studies Group, which talks about all the clinical trials, all the research studies that are available in the UK. And this is a group that we are a part of. We meet once a month and we share information about what studies would be suitable for people in Scotland, just so that we make sure that we're in the loop about that. And then finally, this is our resource called My MND Gene Test, and it is developed by the University of Sheffield. And it's a really helpful resource talking about genetic testing and predictive genetic testing for people who have a family history of a gene. And it's a guide to help you as a decision aid, essentially, to help people decide if they want to proceed with genetic testing or not. And it goes through several pages and several steps of the process and talks through some more specific elements of genetic testing. So it's very valuable. So finally, I just wanted to thank everyone that has contributed to my research now and in the past, in particular patients, people with MND and their carers who've contributed DNA samples, who've contributed information, time and effort into all the genetic research. The CARE MND Consortium, which is the group that we all work with, will work together in Scotland. The genetics services in the west of Scotland and south east Scotland and Edinburgh, and also the genetic research side of things, and the Lothian birth cohorts, which were used as comparison groups for my research, and Columbia University that I mentioned, and also my funders that have funded me over the years. So Chief Scientist Office, the Scottish Government, MND Scotland, of course, who have been really supportive and allowed me to share my research, the Motor Neuron Disease Association, and the University of Glasgow that I'm part of, and the Ewan MacDonald Centre. So thank you very much, and thank you to MND Scotland for allowing me to share this with you.